Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. I was here, I think in around February, we did an event, Kubernetes event with the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I think it was about half the room. Still was a little bit of uncertainty with folks about containers and Kubernetes and that stuff. I think we've gotten over that hump throughout the year. You know, it's interesting. Gene and I have done this event probably about 8 or 9 times around the country. We did a documentary that got shown in a bunch of places. So we've had a chance to talk about this a whole lot. And every time I have to present this, I still have that feeling that I'm the garage band that presents after Rush goes on stage. So yeah, we're gonna have some fun with this. The other thing I noticed this morning was I guess Gene's mom and my mom got together and we have the same shirt on. So afterwards, if you're trying to find us, I've got the blue coat, he's got the gray coat, if you get caught up in the blue checkered shirt. You know, one of the things that we talk about a lot throughout these roadshows, and we've had a chance to talk to a lot of different companies about their journey. Gene's shared stories, I share some stories. And a lot of times the DevOps stories that we tell kind of come across as very peaceful. They're very serene. Everybody gets along. Things are fantastic. Everybody's going faster. You know, you feel great about it. You walk out of that and you go, we're going to do that. And then a lot of the times people will go, well, but where do I start, right? Like, we're sort of in this journey somewhere. Where do I start? And their stories look a little more like this, right? And I apologize to the Canucks fans. You know, somebody in your organization has gotten started, and they're the ones in front, and they're having an awesome time. They're not concerned about any of your problems. And then a lot of you are the ones in the back going like, you blew up my organization, you destroyed my processes, you're making things go faster when we're not used to going faster. I'm 2 or 3 years from retirement. Why do I have to learn this stuff? And both of those things are okay, right? One of the things that I tell folks all the time is, you know, as much as Gene has collected fantastic data about this, there is no consistent starting point that you have to have with DevOps. There is no consistent starting point or even sort of journey that you go along in this journey, whether it's how we're going to change our culture to deliver software faster, how we're going to get people to be more empathetic about stuff. So as you're thinking about this, the thing that I would recommend is, we're going to have a couple of folks come up and do a panel discussion with us, both TELUS and the BC Gov. The guys this afternoon are going to tell some stories. Like, ask questions, like, how did you get there? We're here, how do we get to the next step and so forth? So don't feel like if you walk out of this and you go, boy, I thought I was supposed to be that first serene thing and we're somewhere in between the second thing, that I'm not on the right path, right? We're going to talk about a lot of stories in this. And the storytelling part of this is really important. How many folks have read the Phoenix Project? Okay. How many folks enjoyed the Phoenix Project because there's a part of that that you could relate to? Like, it was personalized, right? Right? The great thing about the Phoenix Project is, I mean, the story is fantastic, and Gene has said, you know, it really is sort of the IT analogy to, to the manufacturing, what we've seen in there. But the thing about it is storytelling is sort of embedded in human culture, right? It's gone back to people telling stories and ghost stories around around the fireplace or around, s'mores or whatever. Like, we like to tell stories. It allows us to humanize things. It allows us to say, these were the emotions we went through. This is how I got along or didn't get along with that person in my organization. And the other thing is somebody can pick up on that story and kind of go tell the part of it that makes sense for them. So you're going to hear me tell some stories as well as we're going to talk about some technology. But that's kind of why we do that, is because inherently as human beings, as we're talking about change, which we're all a little bit uncomfortable with, but all these things are driven by change, you need to find a way to make it so that you can relate it to somebody else, right? Just saying like, hey, I went to a Red Hat seminar and we're going to start doing the DevOps. Like, what does that mean, right? So we're going to try and break that down a little bit for you. So the other thing that we've gotten out of doing a lot of these events is, I sort of took away from this. You know, Gene talks for a while. He goes through a ton of really interesting stories, and then I kind of go like, how do I boil that down? Like, what's the important thing out of DevOps that I should start to sort of measure? What's the thing that if I'm talking to an organization, I can kind of say, yeah, you're on the right track, or you're stuck in the mud, or you're going in the wrong direction even though you think you're going in the right direction. And we've seen this sort of interesting trend. So I call it the most important metric in DevOps. Gene told the story a little bit. Essentially, it's how confident are you that you can ship software into production, right? We can boil down a lot of things. How many deploys per day? What sort of metrics that we collect? Do we collect in a lot of things? And those are all really important. But at the end of the day, you sort of have to ask yourself, like, how confident are we that we can ship software into production? Because that's ultimately what we're sort of getting into. we're getting into a thing where most of your end customers, whether those are internal or external, are used to having one of these things, and they're used to this thing periodically going like, hey, it's time to update software. Hey, it's time to update software. And people now no longer have that fear anymore. They're just like, yeah, I push the button and it updates the software and it's all good. On the back end, though, for you, that means their expectations are higher. They expect you to give them new updates. They expect you to, we have a customer in New Zealand called Macquarie Bank. And Macquarie Bank essentially said, look, we want to make our experience in mobile as good as or better than the last experience that you had with whatever consumer device and app that you had. And you go, wow, that's a bank who's used to just sort of doing numbers, and they want to compare their experience to something like Facebook or Twitter or Snapchat or whatever else they want to do. And ultimately what they're saying is, we've got to be really good at delivering software faster, which at the end of the day is sort of the goal of what we're doing with all this DevOps stuff. Thinking about it in terms of a confidence level, we're going to write code, we're going to go through testing, we're going to look at code quality, we're going to do pipeline integrations, we're going to deploy all those things. But ultimately what we need is a mechanism that says, are we learning from our mistakes? Because you're not all going to be perfect at this, and as Gene said, we're still pulling the end on cord 3,500 times a day or however many times we're doing it. So we're going to continue to make mistakes, but are we learning from them? Are we making them better? Are we designing around agility? Like, are we designing processes knowing that there's a great quote from Andy Jassy, who runs, not from Andy Jassy, from Jeff Bezos, who runs Amazon. And people ask him all the time, they go, Jeff, like, you guys are doing a lot of interesting things. Like, how do you know what the right thing to do is? And he said, I don't really know what the right thing to do, but I do know two really basic things. One of them is nobody's going to want to pay more for a product in the future, and nobody's going to want it slower. Right? So in essence, he's saying, look, I know I have these two constraints that I'm always going to have to deal with. In terms of software, we know people aren't going to want it slower. Yes, they want it to work all the time, and yes, they want it to be more secure, and there's things we can do to work on that, but they don't want it slower. So you work around that constraint as well, or that sort of given. And then are we investing for success? Are we investing in people's skills? Are we investing in the tools to make those things happen? And I'll give you an example of what this means in reality. So Gene mentioned this as an example. KeyBank is a customer. KeyBank's one of the top 15 or so banks in the United States. They work with Pacific Crest out of Portland as well. They're based in Cleveland. They do a lot of acquisitions as part of what they do. And John Rez, who is their VP of DevOps, VP of Architecture and Engineering, essentially they had gone through a massive failure, right? Which for a lot of folks, massive failure, whether that's a heart attack and you start exercising, or a massive outage and you start figuring out, like, why did that happen? But they went through a massive challenge, went through massive failure on one day, sort of picked themselves up, dusted got the dust off their shoes and so forth, and said, how do we fix this? And they got to a point after about 18 months of kind of this transformational journey, which involved containers and involved platforms and involved DevOps. And they had acquired a company. They had acquired another bank. They'd acquired First Niagara. And in essence, they had gone through the process. They were going to now start integrating these things. And they found on the day that they launched the First Niagara acquisition as part of KeyBank under the KeyBank brand, there was something wrong with the website, right? The web experience something was wrong with it. And they were able to deploy 10 changes into production with 0 defects in the middle of the day. That confidence level was like this, right? From 18 months earlier where he said we weren't really sure, he said we took 200 hops to be able to do basic like single sign-in logins to we could do 10 deployments in a day. And comparing those two things, you start to go, okay, if our goal is I want to be confident that I can deploy software, because if I can deploy software quickly, I can make my customers happy, I can make the business happy, I can make the lines of business who have a new idea say, oh, we can do this in a period of time that's reasonable, I can map it out in project management. That's what we sort of work backwards from, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about how we get to that in the context of things like DevOps and so forth. The title of this sort of event was Containers and Culture and DevOps, and how do we accelerate our growth and how do we accelerate our ability to deliver software. And you might look at that and you go, DevOps piece I get. DevOps is dev and ops working closer together. The culture piece, okay, I get that. It's empathy, it's understanding, it's blameless postmortems. It's all the things about working together. In fact, a lot of those things we learned in first grade, right? We learned how to share toys. We learned how to play nicely in the sandbox and so forth. So we should be pretty good at those things. And then we've always had this struggle with technology where there were tools that were built for developers, and then there were tools that were built for ops. And then we sort of said, well, you should just get to know what the other one does, right? Like, you should carry a pager. You should know how to do networking, Mr. Developer, Mrs. Developer. You should understand security firewall rules. And you're kind of like, want to write code. I'm a Java developer. It's like, I don't necessarily need to know all that stuff. And what's interesting is we're always evolving technology. We're always evolving, trying to figure out how to get better at these things. And one of the things that's come along is this technology called containers, Linux containers. How many folks are playing around with using containers, having it somewhere in production and so forth? Okay. That's about normal, a third of the room, 25% of the room, something like that. Pretty normal for where we are today. And containers are interesting for this one sort of simple reason. On one hand, it's a technology that's interesting to developers. So if you're a developer and you say, I always have this problem, if I write code, I write great code, it never has any problem, it works great on my laptop, and then I give it over to ops, and it's their fault because it doesn't run. Like it doesn't scale right, or that's their problem. And then ops is always sort of like, yeah, I'm on the other side of the wall, I can't see what you're doing, I can't replicate your environment. And so containers become this interesting thing because it's now a technology that developers can write code, whatever you want to write. It doesn't limit the frameworks or languages you're using. I can write code, I can run it on my laptop. I can essentially simulate environments on my laptop that say, does this run the way I want it to run, right? Can I do things when I want to do load balancing? Can I do things when I want to scale it or do blue-green sort of updates? And then the way you take that container package and run it through your testing system, run it through your CI system, and it comes out on the other end for ops, it's in the exact same format. It's in the exact same sort of packaged thing. And so from an ops perspective, you go, oh, I have the exact same thing that Mary or Bob said worked, and I can validate that against my environment, right? And so it's not by any means a perfect technology, but it's a technology that you can start to have commonality of language between dev and ops. You can start to have commonality of saying, okay, this will be sort of the artifact, the unit of work, if you will, that's going to go from writing code, testing code, validating it, to getting into production. It's going to be consistent. And from an ops perspective, you go, okay, I can now take it and apply the things that I know I need to do, networking, storage, how I orchestrate where it needs to go, which servers it needs to run on, and so forth. The other thing that's really powerful about containers is how many folks would say that you're sort of looking at what you have in your own data center, good or bad, what's available in the public cloud for various reasons, cost reasons, speed of access, and you're considering something that's of, an operational model that's something of a hybrid, right? People would call it a hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, and so forth. Okay, a little less than I normally get. What we're seeing more and more from people is they're saying, we think either today or somewhere in the near future that we're going to use something in the public cloud. And how they're going to use that may end up being a brand new application, and that's cool. I'm going to sort of lift and shift something that I have today that I want to run on less expensive compute, or compute that's going to be closer to some cool new service like machine learning or AI or something like that. And what they then try and figure out is, like, is there a sort of a standard way to take something that I build in-house and move that into, say, Amazon's cloud, or into Azure, or into IBM's cloud or something? Is there a consistent way of doing that so I don't have to go back through and reformat it and repackage and do all these things? And containers end up being that really consistent thing to be able to do portability between environments, or have consistency of environments. And so we're seeing more and more companies that are saying our hybrid strategy is going to have containers at the center of what they do. So we have a technology that developers seem to like. Tremendous number of developers are beginning to use it. They can use it on their laptop. They can package with it. The testing environments, you can use that as your artifact for what moves through the system. Operations can take it and they can go, okay, cool, I can apply the kind of rules that I need to have for security and networking and compliance and so forth. And it gives me portability whether I want to deal with that now or I want to deal with it in the future, right? So as a technology, and as sort of a feature of Linux, if you will, it's pretty powerful. It gives us a lot of things that, as we're trying to do DevOps, we're trying to do more fast delivery of software, gives us a bunch of really interesting building blocks. And we talked about these things, right? We're starting to build applications differently. We're moving from large sort of monolithic things, whether they're on the mainframe or in a mini environment, or just a large monolithic application. They're becoming smaller and smaller. That gives us the agility to say, hey, I don't have to wait for the entire application to get updated if we want to do updates, right? We talked about this culture we're beginning to see where I want updates more and more frequently. The infrastructure we're working on is becoming more software-centric. It's become more virtualized. We're seeing virtualization happen, whether it's containers or virtual machines on the host. We're seeing software-defined networking. We're seeing software-defined storage. We're seeing sort of instances of load balancers and proxies and so forth being done in software. It allows us to go, hey, I need that instantiated now. Just go ahead and do it. So that's happening very, very frequently and very quickly in infrastructure. And then around process, we're seeing more and more companies that, from a development perspective, a couple of things that are happening. One, we're moving from waterfall to agile and beginning to get into DevOps. We're seeing more and more operations teams who are using technologies like Ansible and others to do things like infrastructure as code, which you say, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you begin to start to have a common language between dev, who's used to codifying something, putting it into source control, doing versioning against it, and then applying it to a job, to also having that happen in operations as well. So I want to codify the action I want to take. I want to deploy a server. I want to deploy a firewall rule. I'm going to codify that. I'm going to put it in version control. I'm going to allow people to go on vacation so that someone else can run that playbook when we want to do things on a regular basis. And containers begin to become very important in all elements of this, right? We see it in applications. We're seeing people containerizing their applications. We're seeing more and more infrastructures. All you have to do is sort of follow the news these days. Every major vendor that's out there is telling you, we're now supporting containers. We're now supporting Kubernetes as an orchestration technology. We're seeing this happening because more and more companies are doing that, and we'll talk about some of those. And then obviously from a process perspective, all this is being driven around how do I go faster? How do I become a little more modular? How do I build technologies that can be easily automated? So containers sort of play into all that. And then finally, we want to be able to build our pipelines just like we've done somewhat in the past, but get to a point where we know that the end artifact, wherever that thing runs, whether it's physical, virtual, private, or public, can be a container. I've got that portability, and I know that it's the exact same thing that developers wanted, and it came out of my testing environments. So we're seeing containers more and more, whether it's in how we're changing our process, how we're changing our technologies, or really how we're getting software into production. So I'm going to tell sort of a personal story. So about 6, 7 years ago, I live in Raleigh, North Carolina, back at Red Hat headquarters. I've been in the industry for a long time. And it was interesting, so maybe around 2010-ish or so, I was talking with some colleagues, and we were sort of saying, we're seeing this cloud thing come along. A lot of us had worked in the data centers for a long time, lots of CLI stuff, CLI jockeys and so forth. And we were seeing this cloud thing happen, and people were talking about like, hey, your entire data center is going to be at the end of an API now. And we were going, wow, what does that mean? Like, I don't really know what that means. You're going to be able to just get stuff on demand. There's no more wait times for things. And so one of the things that we did was we said, there's nobody around me, right? This was sort of before the massive culture of meetups and things were happening. There's really nobody around us to go ask, like, hey, are you doing this stuff? And so a colleague and I started a podcast that was called The Cloudcast. It still exists today. And what we would do is we would start calling people from Silicon Valley, and we would basically say, hey, and this is a fantastic sales pitch, feel free to steal it. Hey, we're 2 guys, we have no audience whatsoever, but we think what you do is really cool. Can you come, we'll record you for 30 minutes and we'll put it on the internet, right? So here's the thing, it's not a great sales pitch, but people that are working on new stuff kind of have a big ego. They like to tell you what they're doing. It sort of blossomed and went. But the thing we were ultimately trying to figure out was like, is this stuff going to be applicable outside of Silicon Valley? Because we were hearing stories about Netflix and all the stories about what Adrian Cockcroft and others were doing. We're going like, will this play in Vancouver? Will this play in Cleveland? Will this play in Kansas City? Is this going to work in Brussels? Like, is this only a Silicon Valley thing? And what we learned over the years, and actually about 2 years into that, doing those podcasts, I get a call from a PR agency, and they said, hey, we'd like you to interview this guy named Gene Kim. And okay. And he's got a book. And I said, oh, great, an author. He's gonna tell me some highbrow thing. He's got patches on his sleeves, and he's like an academic, and he's gonna tell me these stories. And Gene, and we got to talk, and we did this interview, we did the podcast and so forth. And Gene was telling these stories about, about the Phoenix Project. And we went, oh, wow, okay, this is sort of becomes applicable. So that was about 5 or 6 years ago. And at the time, it was like, I don't know if this is ever going to come around to things outside of Silicon Valley, but it sounds really cool. Like, it seems like it solves a lot of these sort of IT problems. And, we're going to talk about BC Gov, right? Red Hat has an opportunity every year to showcase customers, right? We want to showcase sort of our best and brightest customers. And if on the surface you said, hey, your best and brightest customer is going to be a government agency. You would go, okay, I don't know if I want to go to that event. Seems like a slow, boring thing, right? And the cool thing about what the BC Gov guys did, and they're going to come and talk in the panel and all, is they did a very non-government thing, right? Or maybe they did a very government thing, the way you have to think about it. But in essence, what they said was, we're not going to sort of lock ourselves into proprietary technology, and we're going to let the sort of power of the masses help us solve these problems that we have, right? So we have bureaucracy that's sort of built into government. It's kind of why government does what it does. So we're going to go find software that we can readily get, and we're going to make data readily available to people, and they're going to tell more of their story later on. But there's no better story for us to put up on stage in a keynote to say, like, it doesn't matter how fast or slow your organization goes today. There are ways that you can do things today to get access to technology freely and easily, work with communities when you have struggles with it, and then go make people powerful and allow people, if you give them the right constructs, if you give them open APIs, if you give them open data, if you give them self-service access to resources, you're going to get some pretty amazing things come out of this. And I'm going to not tell their story too much. I'm going to let them expose it. But this is what we're seeing, right? We're seeing this not just with Silicon Valley companies, and BC Gov is somewhat geographically proximity, in the same time zone at least. But you wouldn't think of Airbnb and BC Gov in the same sort of like cool, innovative thing. But what they're doing is amazing. And it's amazing because they're applying the principles of things like DevOps. They're applying and they're taking technology like open source. They're leveraging communities. And they're letting people be very, very creative. And so it's a great example of, these things are happening beyond this. And it's happening now because we're 5 or 6 years into the best practices. We've seen really cool things like the Netflix folks who we all sort of worshipped 5, 6, 7 years ago did things like took a lot of their technology and made it open source, right? Things like Chaos Monkey and what's out there for Netflix OSS and so forth. The other cool thing was at Red Hat Summit, we really sort of shifted gears this year. And instead of talking about us and talking about technology and even talking about open source, we spent a lot of time letting our customers talk. And I'm part of the OpenShift team, which is really the container platform team. These were the customers that that basically wanted to tell their story. So these were all public stories. And the thing that's interesting to me about these, and we love having our customers talk about this was every geography, every industry, and some names that you know really well, Deutsche Bank, BMW, let's see, people like Cisco and so forth, telling their story, but also companies that you would go, Swiss Rail, railway company, it's been around for 100 years, sort of monopolistic in their own country, talking about how they're doing things like leveraging mobile apps, re-leveraging the kiosks that used to sit at the terminals that are now doing things around Bitcoin. They're processing 1 million, ticketing on their mobile phone every single day. Hearing stories about Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam wanting to be, the most sophisticated airport that was out there. So we're seeing this more and more. So if you're walking away from this and you're going, oh man, more DevOps stuff, more stuff from Silicon Valley. No, this applies all over the place. It applies to everybody. And I like to tell this story. This is sort of an interesting story. And this is why this stuff is really important, because you taking the time out today out of your schedule says two things. One, you're curious, which is fantastic, right? We're in a time when you really need to be curious about what's possible, what's out there. But the other thing is, we're seeing more and more companies where interesting things are happening that don't have to completely come from the top. So I'll give you an example. Volvo cars. So like everybody says, they make boxy safe cars. Great. And Volvo said, we had this challenge, and this came from, sort of came from the top. Volvo was trying to drive car sales like they typically would do, but their technology team said, there's something out there that I'm not totally sure about, but I'm going to kind of play around with this idea. And they said there's two things that make you want to buy a car, right? The first one is it's that sort of experience where you fall in love with the car, right? You think about driving it, you think about that new car smell, you think about all the things that you need for it, whether it's like I need room because I'm going to put my kids in the back seat, or I want to put the tops down because I want to go fast on a weekend and cruise around. Whatever it is, there's an aspect of making you fall in love with the car. And then the second part of buying a car is that miserable 4 to 8 hours when you go to the dealership and you're like, I don't know what it costs, and they're going to run me around, and it's just this sort of miserable experience, right? And so Volvo said, hey, we have an idea. The technology team said, hey, we have an idea. We want to build a prototype for this. We've noticed that there's these tools like kellybluebook.com, TrueCar, all these other things where people now have access outside of Volvo's domain, access to what cars should cost, right? It's an API in essence. It's an app. It's an API. Well, if that's happening, and I don't necessarily get to control the in-car, the buying experience as it is, right? They just simply put up the signage in the store. The dealers own those things. Well, if the dealers are sort of getting cut out of that experience, right? Their data is being sort of homogenized, or I don't have that asymmetry anymore. I need to go focus more and more of my focus on making that first part of the experience awesome. And what's interesting about Volvo is the technology team said, well, we're going to do that, but we're going to kind of plan ahead a little bit because we know we're going to want to change the experience. So they focused their time around that web experience. So what they did was they said, okay, I don't have in a short period of time the ability to sort of rewrite all my applications to make a better experience because I still have to be able to tie into my supply chain. I got to be able to tell you if we have blue cars available or what the wheel size is or what the torque is and something. All that stuff is back in their supply chain systems and so forth. But they did want to be able to give you 3D model of what the car was like, make you feel like you're driving it and so forth. So what's the point of all this? So what they did in their transformation was they took WebSphere, old legacy WebSphere, put it in containers because they could package it consistently, right? They didn't necessarily change the applications. They now run that on top of OpenShift because they want to be able to say, oh, okay, I don't know where those requests are going to come from. I don't know how much people are going to want to spin the car around. I don't know how much I need to be able to sort of deliver from an experience perspective, but I want to be able to scale to it. And they now run that with OpenShift running on top of 4 different instances in Azure. So somebody took an old legacy application, containerized it so it was easier to package. They took some cost out of how many instances they run. They run it consistently now in this sort of scaled environment on top of a bunch of public cloud instances that are geographically distributed around the world. And it was driven by their internal teams saying, hey, I'm seeing this change happen in the marketplace. And their leadership probably could have figured that out, but their leadership was worried about margins and how much revenue we're driving and so forth. And the technology team said, hey, part of our experience, because I know the business, is now an API. And I don't have to worry about that anymore. And the thing for all of you that's interesting is that can be you, right? We see this at Hilton Hotels, right? This is now my key at Hilton Hotel. That's all runs in containers. The digital key thing runs in containers on OpenShift and so forth. My credit card transaction experience now runs in containers on top of OpenShift. We're seeing companies who a couple of years ago, Lyft and Uber, who make this technology that you go, well, I'm not in the car business, I'm not in the taxi business, but I am in the transaction business. I am in the tracking inventory business. Right? Those are things that we do. They open source their technology. It's called Envoy and Istio and some other things. That technology is now going to get brought in and be able to be used by enterprises around the world, right? And it's going to run in containers. It's going to run on top of Kubernetes and so forth. So we're seeing this really interesting, this shifting happening where really smart, curious folks within IT organizations like yourself are saying, we can rethink what the business looks like. We can make that technology happen. We're seeing the open source communities put technology out that's going to help those things scale. And we're seeing it come from all over the place. We're seeing it come from taxi companies. We're seeing it come from people like Google. It comes from Red Hat. It comes from lots of different companies. But the ability to put that stuff together now is happening faster and faster, and that's really powerful. OK, so this by no means is going to be a complete framework for transformation. There's a great talk that's going to happen this afternoon from our Open Innovation Labs that's going to kind of go into this. But I sort of talk to folks about this all the time. So we've talked about this, right? Everything we're doing is trying to drive faster value. I want to be able to deliver software faster. I want to listen to my customers. I want to collect data back on their interactions, whether it's mobile or web or whatever it is. And I want to be able to get those updates back in. So we're driving this. And so what I tend to talk to people about is there's sort of about 4 ways we can deal with this. Because for most companies, if I was a greenfield, all I'm dealing with is probably mobile, emerging customer trends, and sort of new data silos, right? But for most of us, anybody here just a completely greenfield environment? Oh, cool. Well, you close your ears. You don't have to listen to this part. Everybody else has to deal with everything else, right? Existing customer trends. Yeah, they still want to use web. We still have to deal with lots and lots of different browsers. I've got a whole bunch of different business platforms. I've got Conway's Law basically dictating my org chart, right? Our business looks, our applications look like our business is organized and so forth. And so when people say, like, how do we go through these transformations, there's really sort of 3 or 4 keys that are really important, right? And I draw this with arrows in different directions because we see companies that start on different ends of this spectrum, right? In a lot of cases, the first thing they will do is they'll go, okay, in order for me to be able to pay for a lot of these changes to happen, I've got to be able to take some cost out of the system somewhere, right? Simplest way to do this is to start to automate things. It's why we're seeing so much uptick around things like Ansible, automating Linux environments, Windows environments, networking, and so forth, security environments, because you're able to take cost out of the system by automating a lot of things. The second thing is we're seeing people that are kind of beginning these DevOps evolutions. So we're seeing more and more companies that are saying, well, I'm not going to be able to change everything overnight. Right? It just doesn't happen. It's not a human thing. We kind of have to go through all these emotions. But I am going to start to build out these sort of proof of concepts. I'm going to build these centers of excellence. We've seen examples in Gene's event. The DevOps Enterprise Summit has a ton of great examples of companies who are saying, not only did we start off with a small team that would build minimum viable products, that would build out sort of what's the process, but then they would then take that and turn that into sort of internal training. Right? We hear about companies like Target and Nordstrom's and others who have internal dojos. So in essence, you think about a career path. You've got companies that go, I'm going to allow people to go that want to be curious, that are willing to take some chances. They go out and they play with this new technology. Then they've got to figure out, how do I scale that? Well, they become the internal sort of lead the leaders, teach the teachers types of things. So we're seeing sort of internal DevOps evolutions taking place. And obviously the DevOps handbook is a great way to sort of turn this into process and turn it into things that you can do repeatably. But we're seeing that happen, right, in some cases. The third thing that we see people doing, and again, the order of this kind of doesn't always matter, is we see people that are saying, if I have to go faster and I want to copy what people do in Silicon Valley because I know they know how to go faster, what is one thing that they all do? And every single one of them internally has some sort of application platform that's there to give developers access to resources, self-service access to resources, that's secure by default, that allows me to automate deployments and so forth. So they're making platform decisions, right? How am I going to deploy applications rapidly? How am I going to plug those into my CI environments? And so we're seeing that happen. We're seeing the things happen, the shifts happening around what technologies are leading those platforms right now. Containers is growing like crazy. The technology called Kubernetes is growing like crazy. That's sort of the industry sort of standardized around Kubernetes over the last couple of years. So they're making platform decisions. They're saying, if I'm going to do this rapidly, I need a platform. I can't be sort of handcrafting these things. I can't have snowflakes. And then the last thing they do, or first thing they do, depends on the order, is they're containerizing applications, right? So you can build things from something from scratch. We see lots of people, redoing Java applications in Spring Boot. We see people rewriting applications, doing new applications, but getting them into this common packaging format, and then having this common artifact that comes out at the end of your software pipeline that can go into the platform is really, really important. So we see all these things happening, and what they allow this to happen is, if you want to attack culture, you can attack culture. If you want to attack technology and sort of speed and so forth, you can do these, and you can do them sort of modularly. And we see companies, like I said, going back to that original picture I showed with the couple making out in the streets, right? How you're going to get there isn't always the same way, right? And we can talk about examples of companies that have started everywhere. But these tend to be sort of the common building blocks that we see from people doing this. So real quick, I work on the OpenShift team. We're the platform team. I'm not going to talk about it a whole lot because we have a demonstration and a talk about it. But this is why it's sort of important. It's important in the context of, you want to be able to, right? There's no silver bullet to give you DevOps. So if you came here hoping, man, I hope I'm finally going to get the DevOps silver bullet. I hope they're going to give me a box that says DevOps. I'm going to be able to walk out of it and put it on. Like, that doesn't exist. But there are a bunch of things that you can do to be closer to that sort of framework, right? We feel like the platform is really important for that. You want a platform that, number one, is going to be built around standards for technology, that has communities around it, that's going to scale, that's going to exist for a long time. Kubernetes right now is that technology that's doing it. Kubernetes is at the core of OpenShift. We've had Kubernetes within OpenShift for 3+ years. We're the second largest contributor to that, next to Google. But you want a platform that's going to be highly automated. You want automation built into the platform, right? You want a platform that not only is very well catered for developers, allows developers to bring applications that are in containers, just brings code, integrates nicely with your CI platform, but you also want something that is very distinct in that it allows operators to see what's going on, right? One of the big problems that a lot of companies have always had with platforms is they tend to kind of go one end or the other. We super optimize around the developer, and it's great for demos, and it's great for day one, and applications deploys quickly, and boom, here's my demo. And then the operators go, what is going on? I can't tell you why there's a performance problem. I can't tell you why this image from a registry isn't downloading. I can't tell you why you're getting this error. And so you want a platform that's sort of built to have both of those constructs and context in place. The last thing that I wanted to talk about was a lot of people, when it comes to containers and platform technology, is they go like, where do we start? And this goes back to my original thing that there's not always one starting place. What we found in talking to companies, and probably 400 or 500 OpenShift customers at this point, is they'll start somewhere on this matrix. And it really depends on who's driving it, who's got strength of skills at the time. But they tend to fall into one of these 4 buckets, right? In some cases, the operations team will say, hey, I need a container platform. My developers have been going to a bunch of Docker meetups, or they've kind of gotten bit by the container bug. They're handing them off to us, or what we find they're doing is that they'll get a Linux host from us, and they're putting containers in it, and they call us and they go, oh, I can't attach the storage. Oh, I can't get networking to work. And so they're going to need a container platform because my developers are ahead of us, right? So we see that quite a bit, is that the conversation is, teach me about containers, container standards, Kubernetes, all those types of things. We see a lot of those conversations happening. So it's operations saying, hey, I've got to get caught up with this speed of development. The second thing we see, if we sort of go clockwise, is we see developers who are saying, hey, we're going to build new applications, cloud-native applications, microservices, whatever buzzword you want to use. We're going to build with Spring. We're going to use Netflix OSS. We're going to build in whatever framework. I want to make sure that my platform supports those things, right? I want it to auto-scale. I want it to deal with security for me. Like, I want it to sort of be a platform as a service, right? So whether you love the Heroku experience or you love whatever experience, like, I want it to be like that. I just want to write code. I want it to sort of understand these new cloud-native paradigms in terms of scalability, in terms of impotence, in terms of statefulness or statelessness. That's what's driving it, right? So we see customers who come from that perspective. From a business perspective, a lot of times we will see people that have that hybrid cloud conversation. They say, look, we're not completely ready to do that today, but we are ready to make a decision that says, I may want to use Amazon, I may want to use Azure, I know I've got a bunch of applications that aren't going to move from my data center. Can you give me some framework that's going to allow me to deal with all those things? And this is where the platforms come into place, because the platforms, we talked about containers being sort of portable, but the platforms allow you to say, I want to build one set of operational processes across any of those environments, right? Yes, Amazon does EC2 and storage a little bit differently than Azure does it with Blob and VM instances, and we may do it a little bit differently in a VMware environment, but I want to train my people, I want to write my runbooks to be consistent around one platform, and so we see that. And the last one we see, and the folks from BC Gov are going to talk about this a little bit, we see this a lot, is we'll see this with the Open Innovation Labs, is they go, we know we have to evolve, right? So if you are, for example, let's say you're in the grocery store industry, like, you have a lot of sleepless nights these days because Amazon just bought Whole Foods, and you're going like, giant web giant with tons of data, distribution, like, what is that going to mean in my world? But that may also mean, like, what if Amazon buys an insurance company? What if Amazon decides to get in the car business? What if Microsoft decides they want to, or anybody in that industry goes like, they know how to go that much faster. They're a company that's built on data. They're a company that's built on internet. Like, how are we going to deal with these things? And we're getting a lot of companies that are saying, I just need environments. I'm willing to put money forward. I need environments where I can iterate quickly. I can sort of come up with ideas. And if they stink, we can just blow them up. And we just get rid of them. But something good's going to come out of that, right? Sort of plant a bunch of seeds and 1,000 blooms, flowers will bloom. So we're seeing people that say, I need environments, whether those are online environments completely or something that we can run ourselves, that I can just give developers access to things. I want to give them sandboxes. I want to let them experiment with stuff. And we're going to see what creative ideas come out of this. And so we're seeing that be another area. So somewhere in those 4 quadrants tend to be where people tend to start, and then they evolve over time. Sometimes once the container platform's in place, the application team comes along and goes, oh, cool, like, I can marry the 2 of these things together. So for folks that need something to take back with their boss and say, hey, I learned some stuff and we can save some money doing this, this is a study that we did about a year ago. Went out and talked to a bunch of our customers and said, are things getting any better? And the numbers were pretty good. We were seeing very high ROI. We were seeing a lot of benefit in terms of being able to measure development productivity, developer adding value into the business. And the ROI period around containerized applications, platforms that had high levels of automation, high levels of self-service, were very, very good. And this report's online, and you guys can get these slides after the show and so forth. So the last thing I'll leave with, and this is going to be talked about this afternoon, so a lot of times people will say, that's all interesting, and those stories are interesting, and maybe we're going to be the next Volvo, and maybe we're going to be the next BC Gov, or whatever it is. How do we get started, right? And there are tons of ways to get started with this, right? At least in Red Hat's case, it's always open source. There are always going to be software that you can always get. There are communities, whether that's at meetups, whether that's Slack channels, whatever that is. But for a lot of companies, they go like, I know, but I'm willing. Can somebody hold my hand? Can somebody help me get started? Can we sit down with somebody and make something that's done? We've kicked off a thing over the last couple of years, and it's really starting to gain a lot of momentum. It's called the Open Innovation Labs, and there's going to be a talk about it this afternoon. But in essence, these are a group of people. They're in a bunch of different cities, and we can also make it mobile and come out to where you are, that come out and say, let me help you sit down with you and think about what your process and people and so forth look like today. Where can we improve them? Where can we streamline them? But more importantly, give me something tangible at the end of a couple of weeks sitting down with you guys to go, here's a minimum viable thing. Here's an application that I can show to my management team that says, this is possible, right? We can do these things. We're capable of doing this. And the Open Innovation Labs is a great way to sort of go, okay, how do we have an idea, we have a concern, we have a flashpoint in the business, can we go make that real? And that group is fantastic at being able to help get you over that first hump, kind of get you over the chasm to go, hey, we can make this real, and we can have a framework in place to go scale this out for the business.